My parents were secretly giving my money to my bully sister. When I cut them off, she said, "I wish I bullied you more." So I exposed her to everyone she ever knew. Throughout my entire life, my older sister Katelyn has been resentful of my existence because she somehow decided that I was always trying to steal her spotlight. She made it her life mission to undermine everything I ever enjoyed doing. Our rivalry was not typical sibling behavior. Let me explain. Whenever I dedicated myself to mastering a new skill, she felt compelled to follow suit. If I learned archery, you could bet that Katelyn would show up at school with a bow and arrows, claiming she was interested in archery as well. If I wrote in my diary about having a crush on a guy, she would miraculously start talking to the same guy the next day and act flirtatious with him. Even when I tried to lose weight by adopting a healthier lifestyle, Katelyn would immediately jump on the bandwagon, trying the same diet and exercise routine. It became a pattern. My personal choices were constantly reflected in her actions, and it wasn't just about hobbies. This competition extended to friendships and social circles as well. If I became friends with someone, Katelyn would attempt to integrate herself into the same group, sometimes even going to great lengths to overshadow my presence. The constant copying began to erode my individuality and sense of self. Despite my frustration, voicing my concerns to my parents was pointless. They would respond with statements like, "Sisters imitate each other," and it was considered inappropriate for me to try to control or exclude her from my interests. It seemed like my parents enjoyed the fact that we were always competing, keeping each other on our toes. But what they failed to understand was that I just wanted to pursue my own interests in peace. I wasn't interested in competing, yet Katelyn constantly monitored my activities, always trying to outdo me and creating unnecessary drama. The worst part was that my parents always favored her, even when I was the one genuinely interested in an activity first. I remember they would miss work to attend her recitals, but they would forget about mine. It was as if they believed the world would stop if they missed her important moments. But when it came to mine, it suddenly didn't matter as much. Katelyn would take every opportunity to taunt me about how much our parents loved her more, making snide comments under her breath whenever we were around them. If I reacted, she would pretend she had no idea what had upset me. When our parents weren't around, she was much crueler. She told me that I should end my life because no one would care or miss me when I was gone. She said I would always come second to her in everything in life, and her behavior didn't stop there. At school, she physically bullied me several times, either by deliberately tripping me in front of everyone or by hitting me, claiming it was just a dare from her friends. When my teachers found out, they immediately contacted my parents to complain and threaten Katelyn with suspension. My parents, however, told the school this was a family matter and assured them they would handle it at home. But at home, Katelyn would pretend I had done something to provoke her, which supposedly justified her actions. She was never reprimanded by either parent, and if they ever questioned her, she would start crying, claiming that I was making everything up out of jealousy. The constant favoritism from my parents and Katelyn's relentless need to compete with me created a toxic environment where I struggled to have something for myself. I didn't want to compete with her. I just wanted to live my own life. But Katelyn made sure that was never possible. My friends eventually started calling Katelyn out for her abusive behavior towards me. That's when she escalated her actions, spreading malicious rumors about me. She would come to school with bruises on her thighs or cuts on her forearm, claiming that I was responsible for those injuries when our parents weren't around. Since I was introverted and disliked discussing my personal life with others, it was difficult for me to fight back against these false accusations. Katelyn made sure to talk to every friend I had ever interacted with, even the guys I liked, trying to convince them of her lies. My high school experience was miserable, and that misery followed me even after Katelyn graduated. She had to take a gap year because she wasn't accepted into any universities due to her low grades. Meanwhile, I earned scholarships for college, so my parents didn't have to spend any money on my education. That was when I discovered a devastating truth. My parents had been discussing college funds with Katelyn. They told her they had saved for both of us, but since I no longer needed the money, they were happy to spend both of our college savings on her. They assured her she could study anything she wanted. Furious, I confronted them, but they brushed me off, saying it was their money and they wanted to help Katelyn because she needed it more than I did. I tried reasoning with them, suggesting they save my college fund for me, perhaps to start a business or for my future marriage. My parents scoffed at the idea, telling me I should learn to take care of myself because they were tired of babying me. That night, I cried myself to sleep, heartbroken by the realization that Katelyn would always get everything, while I would be ignored. When it was finally time to move into my college dorm, I made sure to take everything with me, determined not to return home. Unsurprisingly, my parents didn't even offer to help me move. At my lowest point, when I felt completely abandoned, I met Antonio. He was like a breath of fresh air in the suffocating environment I'd left behind. We met during one of the orientation events, and his genuine kindness and warm smile immediately drew me in. As we got to know each other, Antonio became my anchor, offering the stability and support I had always desperately needed. He listened to my story without judgment and provided the comforting presence I'd been missing for so long. During one of my college breaks, my parents insisted I come home for a Christmas celebration. They had invited everyone, and although I didn't want to face my parents alone, I decided to bring Antonio with me. It seemed like a good opportunity to introduce him to my family. I informed my parents beforehand that Antonio and I would be staying separately and that he would be joining us for dinner. When we arrived, my parents were a bit surprised to see him. For context, my parents are conservative, so they naturally judged Antonio's appearance when I introduced him. I had anticipated this reaction and had already warned Antonio about it. Despite their initial surprise, Antonio greeted them warmly and even brought a bouquet of flowers for my mother, which immediately softened her attitude. She was taken aback by his kindness. As the evening went on, everyone seemed charmed by Antonio. He complimented the food, engaged in meaningful conversations, and even offered a heartfelt toast to my parents, thanking them for welcoming him into their home. Some of my cousins came up to me, gushing about how lucky I was to have found such a great guy. They even joked about whether Antonio had any younger brothers, which made me laugh. I was genuinely happy that everyone liked my boyfriend, but it was hard to ignore Katelyn's growing disdain throughout the night. I noticed her having multiple drinks and whispering with a few relatives. Her discomfort with Antonio's presence was obvious, and I could sense something was brewing. During dinner, Katelyn suddenly asked me, loudly enough for everyone to hear, whether I was in a serious relationship with Antonio. Her question caught everyone's attention. I nodded, took Antonio's hand, and confidently told her that we were indeed quite serious. Katelyn smirked and, in front of everyone, insinuated that maybe I should consider settling down with someone more aligned with our family's traditions rather than an outsider. Her blatant racism shocked me, and I noticed some of the guests were visibly uncomfortable with her entitled statement. Katelyn slyly continued, suggesting I should think about our cultural differences and choose someone who reflected our family's values more closely. I was furious, about to speak my mind, when Antonio calmly smiled and responded to her with grace. He explained that he was as American as anyone else, having been born in this country. He even shared that his great-grandparents had immigrated to America and that his family had always valued respect for all cultures and beliefs. While I was hurt that Antonio had to defend himself, I was incredibly proud of how calm and composed he remained while handling Katelyn's negative comments. It only made me more certain that he was the right person for me. As you can imagine, after this awkward exchange, people's opinions of Katelyn were not favorable. The rest of the night, she sat alone, sulking and drinking from her glass, while others avoided her. When we returned to college, I couldn't hold back my feelings any longer. I sent Katelyn a long message, expressing my shame for having her as a sister and telling her that I no longer wanted her in my life. I made it clear that I was done with her toxic behavior and didn't want to acknowledge her as family anymore. Katelyn replied with a short message. Same here. Since that day, I have had no contact with. 3 years ago, Antonio and I got married. I invited my parents to the wedding but chose not to invite Katelyn, despite my mother trying to convince me otherwise. At the wedding, my parents met Antonio's family and friends. It quickly became clear to them that Antonio's family was wealthy. My mother looked shocked, and my father, who usually didn't talk much, was unusually quiet. After the wedding, my parents approached me, surprised at how much money had been spent. They commented on Antonio's family's wealth and asked about our finances. I explained that Antonio and I could afford a nice wedding because we had built a good life together. I reassured them that while Antonio's family was wealthy, our marriage wasn't about money. I was earning a good salary too. Looking back, I realized it was a mistake to bring up our finances with them. 2 years ago, my parents reached out saying they needed help. They explained that since my father had retired and they had spent their savings on house renovations, they were struggling financially. They asked for $3,000 a month to cover household bills and medical expenses as they got older. I was surprised by their request because they had never asked for help before. But as the black sheep of the family, it felt nice to be needed. At the time, Antonio and I were financially stable. We didn't have children, and I was making a good salary. Without much thought, I agreed to help, feeling responsible. I believed they truly needed support, so I started sending them the money every month. When Antonio found out, he was a little confused, pointing out that $3,000 a month seemed like a lot for my parents to need, but we wanted to help. It became routine, and I never questioned how they were spending the money. During this time, my relationship with my parents improved a lot. I'm not sure if they were genuinely kind or just acting nice because I was helping financially, but I believed we were finally bonding. I even started thinking about forgiving them for their past actions and how we could move forward as a better family. 2 weeks ago, my parents surprised me by calling multiple times in the middle of my workday. Knowing how busy I was, I thought it must be an emergency, so I called them back right away. They asked me to come over because they needed to talk, and I agreed. That evening, after a long day at work, I arrived at my parents' house. They seemed nervous, so I asked if something was wrong. They started by thanking me for the financial help I'd been giving them. I nodded, confused. Then my mom told me some unexpected news. My sister Katelyn, who I hadn't spoken to in years, had gotten married 2 years ago and had been struggling with infertility. I was shocked. I didn't even know she was married, let alone trying to have kids. Mom explained that Katelyn had finally gotten pregnant but had a miscarriage, which left her devastated. Now, Katelyn was thinking about trying in vitro fertilization, IVF, to have a baby, but the procedure was expensive. They said she needed $25,000 to pay for it. My parents looked at me hopefully and told me it was my duty as her sister to help her out. They added that families should always help each other, and this was the least I could do for Katelyn. I was stunned. I couldn't understand why they thought I should be responsible for covering such a huge expense, especially given the strained relationship between Katelyn and me. I reminded them that Katelyn and I had never had a close sibling relationship because she had bullied me throughout my life. I told them there was no way I could give her such a large sum as a gift. They didn't like my response. They insisted that, as her sister, it was my responsibility to help Katelyn become a mother. They even said that since I didn't have kids, the least I could do was help bring a grandchild into the family. I tried to be calm and offered a compromise. I said I felt for Katelyn, but I wouldn't give her the money as a gift. However, I was willing to lend her the $25,000 if she signed a legal contract agreeing to pay me back or face legal action. My parents were furious when they heard this. They said it was offensive to even suggest such a thing and argued that I had plenty of money and should just give it. My mom scolded me, calling me selfish and saying Katelyn needed the money more than I did. I was furious at their entitlement. I reminded them that I had worked hard for everything I had, and I had my own financial responsibilities. I couldn't just hand over that much money to someone who had made my life difficult and with whom I hadn't spoken in years. I told them that if they didn't agree to my terms, they shouldn't expect any money from me. At this, my parents started yelling. They told me this was why they disliked me so much. They accused me of being arrogant and always acting like I was better than everyone else. I was shocked by their harsh words, especially since they had just been asking me for money minutes earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with all the money I'd been sending my parents. Despite their attempts to guilt-trip me, I stood my ground. I excused myself to use the restroom, knowing I only had a short window of time. Quietly, I tiptoed to their bedroom and saw my dad's phone on the bedside table, still plugged into the charger. I knew it was wrong to snoop, but the uneasy feeling in my gut was too strong to ignore. I decided to check his messages. That's when I found the transaction records. $1,800 sent to my sister every month for the past 2 years. I couldn't believe it. My suspicions were confirmed, and the betrayal hit me like a cold wind. It wasn't just about the money. It was realizing they had been manipulating my emotions and lying to me for 2 whole years. My heart raced as I took in the full extent of their deception. I went back downstairs, unable to hide how hurt I was. I directly asked my parents where the $3,000 I had been sending them each month was really going. They looked surprised, stumbling over their words as they tried to explain. I confronted them about the money they were sending to Katelyn, $1,800 each month. Their faces went pale, and for a moment, they were speechless. In the tense silence, the truth started to come out. They admitted they had been secretly sending a large portion of the money I gave them to Katelyn. They tried to justify it by saying she needed the money, and as her parents, they couldn't stand to see her struggle. I was furious. What about me? I asked. Didn't you feel any guilt taking money from me while lying to my face for 2 years? They said Katelyn and her husband had low-paying jobs, and since I had an extravagant wedding and a stable, well-paying job, they assumed taking the money wouldn't affect me. They also admitted that it was Katelyn's idea originally, and they went along with it because they thought they were just doing what was best for their kids. Fueled by anger and disappointment, I had had enough. I told them I would no longer send them any money and was cutting off all financial support. Desperate and upset, my parents immediately started begging, saying I couldn't abandon my family when they needed help. I scoffed and walked out. As I left their home, I felt a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, and a surprising sense of freedom. Now, as I write this, they continue to call, begging me not to cut them off and promising they won't send any more money to Katelyn. Am I wrong for considering cutting off my parents after their betrayal? It has been difficult for me to share these experiences because many people think I'm either exaggerating or not being honest. So, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support. I feel very emotional knowing that at last people believe my childhood stories. We've both agreed that this will never happen again, no matter what, even if my parents are on their deathbed. In the meantime, my parents continue to call and send messages. They switch between pleading, apologizing, and trying to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. Despite this, I am staying strong in my decision to have no contact. Update 2. It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and something unexpected happened this past weekend. Katelyn reached out to me. I was shocked since I didn't even know she had my number after all these years. I had hoped her silence meant she had moved on, but I was wrong. Instead of being remorseful, her message was full of anger and accusations. She called me entitled and childish, claiming she had hated me her entire life. She accused me of being a gold digger who married Antonio for his money, saying I didn't deserve it and that, as my family, they were entitled to it. Her words were cruel, even saying she wished she had bullied me more as a child so I'd never forget what she was capable of. Reading her message made me feel sick. and I couldn't help but cry. All the trauma I had gone through came rushing back. I knew I couldn't handle this alone, so I showed the message to Antonio. He was furious and decided he'd had enough. Antonio took charge and created a group chat with my parents, Katelyn, and several relatives. He sent screenshots of Katelyn's messages and explained that he was stepping in because Katelyn and my parents had been threatening and pressuring me to keep sending them $3,000 a month. He exposed the lies my parents had told me over the past 2 years and revealed how Katelyn had bullied me throughout my childhood. As you can imagine, things exploded within a few hours. Relatives quickly responded, shocked at how far my parents had gone to take advantage of me and how shameless Katelyn had been. Some called me directly, and I explained how my parents admitted to sending Katelyn $1,800 each month from the money I gave them. Everyone was outraged, and my parents faced serious backlash. My parents then begged me to delete the group chat and unsend the messages, but Antonio stood his ground. He told them that he had created the group and was done with their nonsense. He warned them that if they ever asked me for money again, he'd hire the best lawyers and sue them. Since then, they haven't dared to contact me. I've heard from relatives that my parents are deeply embarrassed and, for the first time, have scolded Katelyn for her behavior. They reportedly regret defending her now that her bullying has been exposed. However, it's too late for reconciliation in my eyes. I plan to keep my no-contact approach and live peacefully with my husband. Update 3. I just want to say that all of you are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for your support. In just a few days since my last update, I've been overwhelmed by the kindness and encouragement from so many of you. If I could, I'd respond to each of you personally, but I don't have the finger strength for that. Neither my parents nor Katelyn have contacted me, and I'm confident after Antonio's warning that it'll stay that way. The support from my cousins and other relatives has made me feel more secure in my decision. Antonio and I have been considering talking to a therapist to help me process the pain of cutting off my parents and the betrayal from my family. As I move forward, I want to focus on taking care of myself and appreciating the good things in my life, like being with Antonio. The road ahead may be tough, but with the right people by my side, I believe things will get better. I hope this will be my last update.